Right, so welcome back to the second part of tonight's Towpath Talks. And our next guest is Kat Magill. Kat grew up on the flat and boring plains of the American Midwest and escaped as soon as she could, searching for mountains and adventure. She loved the outdoors and nature for as long as she can remember. At the age of 9, she wrote to the local newspaper, protesting against plans to cut down her favorite woods to put in a new housing development. Alas, no one listened to her. But she did manage to rewrite the article at the age of 13 and earn $100 for getting it published in the city newspaper. Growing up, she often tried to persuade her friends and siblings to sleep outside, with mixed success. There were more than a few back garden camping trips that ended at midnight relocation to warm and cozy beds. Kat spent a good few years wandering the world until she landed in Edinburgh 10 years ago. She's not entirely sure why she is still in this cold, wet and boggy country. But she piles on the waterproofs and does her best to make the most of it, exploring the hills, valleys, and bogs on foot and by bike. More recently, she's participated in ultra races, including the Highland Trail 550 3 times, the Atlas Mountain Race, and the Silk Road Mountain Race, which she will be talking about tonight. Over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Isa, and thank you everybody for coming. It's really nice to see a lot of familiar faces from all over the place. Obviously, the reason I was invited to speak tonight was to talk about the Silk Road Mountain Race. And what was it like to ride or race, depending on how you see the experience, my bike for 13 days through the mountains and valleys of Kyrgyzstan? The race covers about 1,900 meters, or 1,900 kilometers, a little more than 1,900, and more than 30,000 meters of elevation, and it's largely off-road. Unlike the Highland Trail, it doesn't involve massive hike-a-bikes, but you do end up pushing your bike up some pretty long mountain passes. There are more mountain passes on the race than you really want to know about. I probably should have given you an elevation profile, but I just stuck up a pretty picture. I'd like to say that I signed up to the Silk Road race by accident. After 2023, I'd done a bit of racing, and I decided I wasn't sure if I really wanted to race anymore. And at the end of the year, I'd said, I'm not going to do any races in 2024. And, well, we all have this lovely thing on our phones called Instagram, and Instagram has all these pretty pictures, and people post them, and they talk about the races that they did. And it was sometime around this time last year, and I was like, ugh. February in the UK is so awful. I need a way to escape. Oh, look, Atlas Mountain Race. Oh, there'd be sunshine in Morocco. That sounds like a great idea. Let me just sign up. Didn't really think about it that much. And I was just finishing my application for Atlas Mountain Race with my friend Jade, who you might know, Jade Field. She's renowned for her very long bike rides all over the place all the time. She's quite an impressive person. And she called me up and she was like, oh, hey, Kat, I'm going to do Silk Road Mountain Race next year. Now, I know you're not racing next year, so I'm calling just to ask, do you want to go touring in Kyrgyzstan with me for a month beforehand? And I was like, let me have a think, and can I call you back? Had a little think about it. It didn't take very long, and I called her back, and I was like, Jade, I want to do the race. And I didn't really give it a lot of thought, but there was just, I don't really know why I signed up for it, and that's something that I would think about quite a lot in the months after making that decision. But basically, I knew that if I didn't take that opportunity, I would never do it. And I think it was quite a reach for me. It felt like a big reach. And having somebody that I knew who was doing it just was like a tipping point that was like, okay, this is going to be a really, really amazing thing to do. And the only way I'm going to do it is because you've asked me to go to Kyrgyzstan. And I'm just going to, what's the word? I'm missing the word, but take over your idea to do the race. And I'll do the race too. But I wanted, before I talk just about the race, I feel like there's a lot of narrative around ultra racing. And some of it's, well, I'm going to talk a bit about the narrative, but I wanted you guys to know why I love riding bikes, which is the most important thing to me about any of this, and it's not really about ultra races or, doing big stuff. It's just about really loving riding bikes. So let's start with a nice old picture. It took me a really long time to learn to ride a bike. I think, if I remember correctly, I was 7 before I got the stabilizers off. And my mom told me this picture was when I was 4. So I've either misremembered something or I rode a bike with stabilizers for a really long time. But I did finally manage to learn to ride my bike. And when I was 13, I was introduced to the idea of cycle touring. So a family friend was taking a group of teenagers on a 550-mile bike trip across Indiana and Ohio or some other very boring and flat place. Anyways, I'd heard about this ride, and I knew that I wanted to do it. I didn't do much sports as a kid, and I always really wanted to. And I was like, I'm going to do that ride. And so I basically spent hours on this horrible. I asked my mom for a picture of this stationary bike that we had at home, and she couldn't find a picture, but it was really awful. Like a rusty kind of metal, imagine like a very long time ago, what kind of trainer, what trainers look like totally manual sort of thing. And it sat outside on the porch of my parents' house in a very hot and humid summer, and I sweated my guts out training for that race. And I had an amazing time, and that was kind of my first experience with realizing that riding a bike was a great way to go on adventures and to discover things, but also it was a place where I really felt good about myself. And I think, 13 is a tough age, and lots of stuff is happening, and I just had this amazing experience. And also, you can hardly see it, but that pink thing on the front of my bike, I managed to find this bike bag that was an insulated pouch, and I would get ice cold water from lunch and tons of ice and fill the water bottle and put it in there. And halfway through the afternoon, I'd go around and come up behind my friends and squirt them on the back with ice cold water. So I do need to find another thermal bike bag, I think, bottle bag. But anyways, that happened, and then I went back to my Indiana life, and I didn't know a lot of other people doing sports, and I wasn't really encouraged to do sports, and so that was sort of well, I've got this bike, I went on a few rides, and not much more. And then when I was 24, I went to live in West Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I lived in this lovely mud hut with no running water or electricity, about 7 kilometers from the nearest gravel road, and I lived there for 2 years. And, life in the village was interesting. We had to get the pumpkins off my roof and do other fun things, but it was also quite difficult and quite lonely, quite boring for me, who's kind of an adventurous person. There was a lot of adventure involved. It was very stationary. And so to break up the monotony, I started riding my bike and just strapped a bunch of stuff to the back of the bike. You just took old inner tubes and just wrapped stuff and stuck it to the bike rack. Works great. You don't need big, expensive, fancy bike bags. You just need old inner tubes. And as I was looking through old pictures, I realized that was also when I discovered that I love hike bike, which I didn't really understand. I didn't really remember this, and I didn't remember that I loved it. And then I was like, oh, this is where it all started. So at the end of my 2 years of Peace Corps service, I was really craving to expand my boundaries even more. I'd done a few kind of cross-border trips because I lived in the far southeast corner of Senegal, and they weren't too far from the borders of Mali and Guinea, and so I'd snuck across the borders, doing some exploring on my bike with friends, got chased by a drunk border guard, hid in the bushes, no problem, got back to Senegal, which was quite good, and then I realized I wanted to cross borders a bit more legally and go on a bigger adventure. So I had to return the bike that Peace Corps had given to me, and so I picked an old frame out of a pile of bikes, and I slowly, over a year, planned this trip and pilfered bike parts off of the lovely guy in Dakar who helped manage the bikes, and ordered some crazy panniers and filled them entirely full and more, it seems, and then took my bike on roads like this. So needless to say, it was a bit tough, and by the time I got to the end, I was pretty worn down and pretty lonely. I'd ridden through a lot of places that don't see a lot of tourists or other people, and so I got quite a bit more attention than I would have liked, and it was really tough, you just want to eat a sandwich, and 50 people want to come out and watch you eat a sandwich. And you're like, that's not really that interesting, but for them it is. And so, so it was a bit tough, but I knew that I really, really loved these bike adventures, and I wanted to go on more bike adventures. So I thought it might be a bit more fun to do something with friends. So I spent a year teaching English in Japan, and then with a group of other English teachers, we had this self-organized cycle trip that went from the top of Hokkaido in the north to Kyushu in the south. And we just had tons of fun together. And I was like, okay, this is good. I like this. I like doing these adventures. I'm going to do more of them. And, once one thing happens, you just start dreaming about the next and the next and the next. So this is the reality of a bike adventure. All those nice photos that people show you, it's actually like lie down on the ground and spread all your stuff everywhere and fix your bikes, etc. But I ended up cycling in Argentina and Chile a bit by myself, and then randomly in Bariloche I ran into an old friend who I'd known from Peace Corps, who'd actually inspired my first big tour, and rode with him and a bunch of people all the way down to Ushuaia. And then, my dreams just, they just kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And somewhere along the way, I'd started, the internet was coming up more, and I was getting access to the internet, which I hadn't had much of living in a mud hut. Didn't have a mobile phone at that time or any signal. And so I started looking at pictures and reading stories and then talking to people. And that's kind of when I first heard about Silk Road as, a cycle tour. So I started to kind of dream this dream of riding my bike, maybe around the world, but at least my next kind of big trip that I had planned was something across Central Asia, including the Pamir Highway in Tajikistan and the Karakoram in Pakistan, and then maybe some parts of northern India. Life happens, and sometimes you make other choices, and things change your plans. And I made it to Ladakh and spent a couple months cycling around the north of India, which was really just phenomenal. I highly, highly, highly recommend it if you have a chance to go there. And then that was sort of the end of my big international cycling adventures. And then it was welcome to wet, boggy, and cold Scotland. And I heard about the Highland Trail quite early on when I moved here because I'd heard about, these kind of I was interested in these big bike adventures. But honestly, I really could not cope with the weather. I'd been living in the tropics for quite a long time, and just tropics to Scotland is not a good adjustment. I really do not recommend that. And my dear friend Megan, who's here, has tried to get me to stop moaning about the weather in Scotland for years, but I don't think she's been particularly successful. But yeah, so I heard about this thing called the Highland Trail, but I just thought, this is way out of my league, just totally, I ride my bike for fun, riding your bike for 12 or 14 or 16 or who knows how many hours a day, it's not really my thing. Riding through the night, had never done that. If you had told me then that I was going to do something like the Lakeland 200, which was, I think, my single longest straight-through ride, maybe, was 37 hours. Maybe I did longer, I don't know. It's possible I've done longer than that. But that was pretty long. I would never have believed you. But anyways, yeah, I rode little bits and pieces of the Highland Trail over the years, and then I just saw something on Instagram, and Instagram is to blame for all my life problems. And somebody who'd ridden it before was like, we're trying to get more women to sign up, you should do it. And I saw something else on Instagram that was like, yeah, just do the hard things and seize the moment. And I was like, okay. So I signed up for the Highland Trail, and basically I think with all of these things, you never feel ready, even up to the moment that you literally are on the start line. You're like, I haven't trained enough, and I haven't done enough, and I'm not strong enough, and whatever. And just saying you're going to do it and committing yourself to it is the best way to get yourself out of your own self-imposed limitations and figure out what you can do. Some people might say that the Highland Trail isn't a great first ultra race, but it had everything that I loved: mountains and magical places that take your breath away, and long hike bikes, and the reward of getting to the top. Also had a few things I didn't like so much, but this is also part of the journey. And yeah, this is a fun little, let's see if you can see what happened here.
Made a small mistake.
So yeah, Highland Trail has a lot of that, and that was my introduction to ultra racing. So in 2023, I rode the Highland Trail for a second time. It was kind of a bit of FOMO. I wasn't really planning to do a lot more racing, but I thought I wanted a better go at it, and I'd struggled quite a bit the first time around, and so a bunch of friends were riding, and I was like, I'll do the Highland Trail a second time just for fun, and it was actually fun. But as I was saying, kind of towards the end of 2023, I was like, I'm not quite sure I want to do so much racing. And this is, I guess, maybe a story that doesn't always come out when you just talk about the race that you did and how you trained for it, but it's also the experiences you have kind of behind the scenes. And as I've mentioned Instagram a few times here, and Instagram has played quite a critical role in a lot of my getting back into some of these bigger, but has played the role in getting into people that I've met. I met Jade kind of through, I did the Highland Trail because of Instagram. I got an Atlas Mountain Race with Instagram. It's just like, geez, don't download Instagram. You already have it, I'm sure. Anyways, it's an amazing community, and a great source of inspiration, of amazing adventures, and ways to meet incredible other people. But this kind of ultra racing and Instagram landed in my life in a time where I was also struggling quite a bit personally. So I was in a really difficult job that was a terrible fit for me. And over the 2 years that I spent in that job, I basically lost kind of all my self-confidence. There were compounding issues, COVID and working from home and kind of losing my, my work-life community. But I just really I don't know, I really don't have words for how to describe it, but I just sort of eroded, and internally and in every way, I was just questioning my capability to do any kind of job, to be hireable, and that kind of transferred over into my physical capabilities. And it's like a mental state, right? Once you start thinking negatively, it sort of just spirals into lots of other stuff. So I'm not here to go on a rant about social media, but I think we're all aware of the impact that it can have on our lives. And I think when I was in a very vulnerable place for other reasons, and without being really conscious of it, this kind of just thoughts sort of permeated that, I wasn't tough enough, I wasn't strong enough, I didn't want to deprive myself of sleep, I didn't want to feel horrible all the time, I didn't want to eat disgusting things. And this is what I saw just in all of these stories about ultra racing. It's oh, you have to be so tough, and look at the brutal conditions this person got through, and look at this amazing thing they conquered, and oh, look at them collapse on the finish line, and oh, look at this horrible, disgusting petrol station food that they're eating, and oh, they're sleeping on the side of the road in a bin bag. And I was like this is just it wasn't stuff that I'd ever been interested in, but I just started telling myself, well, if you don't want to do this stuff, you just must not be good enough. And we all know that you can get very good at something, but you need to dedicate yourself to that completely. And if you're just going to kind of be a normal person and have a normal life, there's always going to be people who are tougher or more amazing or more incredible or more whatever than you. And yeah, you cannot live in that kind of state of comparing and always thinking that you're not good enough. But that was sort of the thoughts that had pervaded my mind by the end of 2023, and where I was I need to get away from this. This is just making me feel a bit shit about myself. And I know that there's something that I love so much more about riding the bike. I know I like big challenges. I know I like big adventures, but this kind of narrative is just eating away at me. And so then, okay, well, what did I do? Then I just signed up to Atlas and Silk Road, which is really, what on earth was I doing? And basically, before Atlas, just a lot of stuff happened. Ultra races are really, really hard to prepare for logistically, unless you're a super logistically minded person. You can see I didn't even manage to get my bags on my bike. It's totally filthy. I am not a logistically minded person. So I find them quite stressful to prepare for. And I just was having tons of stress before Atlas, and I got ill, and I scratched from Atlas. And I hadn't really scratched from a big race like that before. And it wasn't the scratching that was the problem. It was not finishing the race. Because you put so much effort and so much planning into these races. And everybody says, oh, you're the winner if you get to the start line. And you're yeah, well, if you don't get to the finish line, it doesn't really, it doesn't really reward you anything. You don't get to the start line and be yeah, I've done it. You get to the finish and you're yeah, I've done it. And so not having that sense of oh, I know I can do this. I did finish it. Was really, really just kind of really put my head into a worse space. So I would say the months leading up to the Silk Road for me were characterized by what I would call almost crippling self-doubt. It's natural to have anxiety about taking on a challenge this big with this many unknowns, but I really had kind of lost all sight of why I loved this stuff, and I just couldn't find any positive emotions in me about it. I was just petrified. And there's good reason. I mean, there's some pretty big climbs in it. And you can do all your preparation, and no matter how much you prepare, there's always going to be all kinds of things that happen along the way that you weren't prepared for, or that just are terrible or awful or really difficult. Yeah, I mean, that's just part of the nature of the race. But what I was feeling was just kind of like massive paralysis. And I was working with a coach at the time, and she asked me to write down everything that I was scared of about the race. So this is my list. Cold, dark, bad weather, scared in general, scary people, can't find the way, river, sick, injured, mechanical, body not working, poor mental state, hands numb, tired, feel like I'm not going to make it, run out of food, run out of water. So these kinds of thoughts were just like what was going through my head the whole time leading up to the race. And this was kind of the first, going over the first pass. And I'd started the first day quite ill, and I wasn't feeling very good. And yeah, that's one. And it wasn't like a great way to start the race. So I'd already kind of had all of these negative thoughts. And then I'd been ill. I was ill at the very beginning. I missed a really important part. I'm going to go back because I'm getting carried away with all my talking. But part of why I wanted to mention Kageti, so this is the first pass in the race, and I had gone over Kageti. I'd been touring, so Jade and I did end up going touring with another friend before the race. And we went over Kageti and a few of the other passes, and I began to get a sense of what it would be like being in Kyrgyzstan. But I just still was telling myself continuously, oh, Kat, you're not strong enough. And I was saying to Jade, I can't do this race. I'm not strong enough. And it was 2 days before the race, and I was like, I'm not even sure I'm going to start. I'm just not convinced I'm going to start. And I was sitting in a cafe with somebody that I'd met, and we were talking about this. And he said to me, you've got to embrace being uncomfortable and just stop trying to run away from it. And he was like, you don't have to go to the start line if you don't want to, but you're just so scared of all of these things, which are fundamentally just about being uncomfortable. And if you only want to be comfortable, you'll never realize your dreams. He didn't exactly say that, but that's my interpretation. That was how I took it on. Because, I was just in a state. So anyways, I got sick very early on and wasn't that happy. And getting ill at the very beginning sort of made me realize that I really, really, really wanted to do this race. And I think I just was like, oh my God, the race might be taken away from me before I've even had the chance or to make the choice of not doing it. And in that moment, I was like, okay, look, I really, really, really want to do this. So for the first couple of days, I just put my head down and I was like, okay, I've got to stop being sick. I can't focus on being sick. I've got to just keep going. My body has to kind of survive this and get through. And so I did just keep going. The second day was sort of like Scotland. It wasn't very inspiring. It was full of, it's beautiful, but full of kind of rainy, sloggy climbs and some beautiful horses along the way. And when I woke up on the third day, I saw these mountains, and up at the top of these I knew was Songkhul Lake. And I knew there was a big climb to get up there, which we'd done on our tour. And I also knew what was waiting for me, which was this lake. So I can mute. I just want to play. Anyways, I got to the top of the climb, and this is what I saw at the top of the climb. And I'd been there before, and when we'd been there on the tour, it was just this kind of really magical place. The lake is at about 3,000 meters, and it's surrounded by pasture, and everybody takes their animals up there in the summertime to feed the animals in the pasture, and they live in yurts around the lake. And it's just kind of got these mountains on all sides. So you feel like you've just kind of gone up and landed into this magical land, and it's just very, very, very peaceful. And it really been a place of peace for me on the tour. And then when I knew that I was going back there, suddenly my mood started to change. And I started to feel really excited about where I was going. And I knew that these were the kinds of experiences and feelings that I was going to have. And I just something shifted quite deeply inside of me, and the fear just sort of started to melt away, and all the anxiety and all the worry and the feeling that I'd been looking for months and not finding came back, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy that I'm here. Like, I just love to be here. This is like what I wasn't sitting there like, oh, what a privilege to be here. I was just like, oh, this is amazing, you know. And it's kind of like a balance of, oh, this is amazing, with a bit of like, oh, this is like actually still really hard. But you know, my mood just kind of shifted overall, and I was really just excited to be in this race. And then we got to the yurt camp, and so a big part of being in a race is kind of the community, and that was something that definitely was part of getting me to the start line and part of making the race so amazing. So you periodically throughout the race, you come to checkpoints or you stay in guest houses and you run into people and you have a chat and a catch up and you're like, oh, how was your first day? How was your second day? You know, and then you're like, oh, I was sick. And they're like, oh, my charging thing, you know, isn't charging. And oh, I need to filter my water. And you have all this like, you start to build these kind of shared experiences. And then, yeah, it's just really, I don't know, really special places. And that night we left checkpoint 1, went past all the animals being in there, put into their pastures for the night by the yurt, and then rode down this incredible pass, which we'd ridden up in a thunderstorm, which was quite scary, and rode down that under a full moon. And then arrived at the guest house, and this is one of the downsides of ultras, is that if you're in remote places and there's not a lot of options of where to stay, everybody ends up at the same place. So the dream of like having a nice warm bed sort of disappeared, but I did manage to get a place to sleep, and met the lovely Jono and Erin, who were kind of my shared adventure buddies for a lot of the race. I saw them quite frequently. And again, like this is just all part of like my whole, you can even hear it, you know, just my whole mood sort of shifted. And I started to really enjoy being there and just be so appreciative of all the company. And, you know, passing all the horses and going on all the crazy mountain passes, and eating delicious things like tinned fish straight out of the tin. And then kind of the scenery that we got along the way. So this is Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin pass. So another moment of sharing a lot of places with other people on the race. And as I went on, you know, the climbs were obviously very hard, but you kept seeing this community of people on the way, and every time you saw people, you just get like a burst of energy again. And then, so I was kind of fluctuating between being on my own and then having kind of some hard sections and then being with people. And then I think what really stands out for me about this race is, again, I just call them magical places. I talked about it a bit on the podcast, but just places that you go to that are so otherworldly. This was on the Chinese border road towards the kind of the very, I guess, southernmost point of the race. And I got up there, basically, I'd seen tons of people on Mel's Pass. They'd all gone shooting off in front of me. I'm not a particularly fast rider. And I hit the road where you kind of head towards the Chinese border area and basically came around the corner and there was just like huge mountains and a big black storm. And I was like, oh, these are the things that I'm afraid of. And, it's like, well, Kat, like, it's not like, you live in Scotland, it's not like you've never dealt with a thunderstorm. Or, well, thunderstorm, no, but like a big storm. So, what do? You stop, you put on your waterproofs, you have your little snack because you're not going to have a snack in the storm. And, of course, it passed and I didn't die and it wasn't as terrible as I thought. And I got to enjoy views of yaks and mountains after the storm passed. And then it kind of fell night and I was very much alone and it was very dark and very cold. And I was riding just like, what am I going to do with myself? I didn't, on the list of things I was scared of, it was probably not where to sleep. I have a lot of anxiety when traveling about where am I going to sleep. I just want to sleep somewhere that I know I'm going to be safe and comfortable and warm and not worried about anything. And there just wasn't really any place along this road that I felt like I wanted to sleep. So I kept going because there was the border crossing, and apparently there was this caravan at the border crossing that would sometimes have a warm place for people to sleep. So there's quite a lot of motivation when you're scared of where to sleep to just keep going. So I kept going and watched this kind of light slowly appear in the distance for like an hour and a half, putting on all my really warm mittens and everything because it's really, really freezing. And then I arrived at the caravan and either just like, oh, slumber party! And it's just, it's such a crazy experience to go from like, I'm freezing, I'm alone, I'm cold, there's just like barbed wire on one side of me and nothing on the other side, and I don't know what to do with myself, I don't know where to sleep or where to camp, and and I'm cold, and oh well, I just like keep pedaling, just stop thinking, keep pedaling, and then like, suddenly you're in this like cozy bed with your mates and having a good laugh, and it's like you just sort of go through these totally crazy emotional experiences along the way. I'm going to skip a few things. That was the caravan the next morning. It was freezing cold, more of the Chinese border. And then this is kind of, one of my really, really magical places. So this was checkpoint 2, up kind of quite high up in the mountains. And got to checkpoint 2. And again, so part of the narrative in social media, a lot of, you might have heard about, if you know anything about the Silk Road Mountain Race, you'll have heard of the old Soviet road. And they just make it sound like this horrible experience. It's like it's 20% gradient and, there's barbed wire on the floor and people struggle to breathe at the elevation and they've got to push their bikes and they show these pictures of everybody with their bikes like over their heads, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so scared of that. And then you get there and you're like, this is nothing worse than Highland Trail, right? Like, yeah, you got to push your bike over your head, but you do that on the Coffin Road, and, I've already done it before, and you just take 2 steps, and you stop, and you take 2 steps, and you stop, and okay, you can't breathe very well because you're going up to 3,800 meters, but the thing that you also get at the Coffin Road, but not nearly this amazing, is you get this incredible view, and then you're up there entirely alone, just like glaciers and mountains as far as the eye can see, and you're just like, oh my God, I just want to stay here. And I had so many moments along the race where I was like, I'm just feeling all of the feelings, and these places are so incredible, and I just want to press pause and stay. And that was definitely one of them. Unfortunately, you don't get to stay, but whatever. I'm going to speed through so I don't talk for hours. This is a fire pot meal. I don't know if any of you have ever tried cooking a fire pot meal and then carrying the cooked meal on a rough off-road. But it makes these lovely little balls with your food, which I was quite surprised to find when I opened my meal one evening. I'm going to whiz through because I can't talk you through the entire race. But this was another one of the places where I've been on the tour, that valley leading up to the Arabelle Plateau, and it's just absolutely stunning. And it had all these rivers, and again, these river crossings was something I was really afraid of. But because I'd been in the valley and I knew it, I knew the rivers weren't so scary, except for the last one, which turned out to be a bit deeper than I expected. And then you climb up this big, kind of these switchbacks, and you end up on the Arabelle Plateau at about almost 4,000 meters. And then you literally go straight down this crazy mining road where you feel like the mountains are just sort of falling down the sides, and the road is made of the scree, and beneath them it doesn't feel particularly safe. And get to checkpoint 3, and then, it's just kind of, it's like, I'm going faster now, but it's like this flip-flop of like alone, scary, big, high mountains, people, whoa, lots of people, and then like all of a sudden your back is straight up into the mountains again, and you're completely alone again, and it's just like, obviously this happens over a more extended period of time than like 2 minutes when I'm speaking, but it just like, I think this is why you get kind of addictions to these races, because the amount of emotion that you get and the experiences that you have along the way are so intense, and the longer that you go and the more tired that you get, the more intense the experiences get. And then you cross rivers. This doesn't look that bad, but it actually was quite wide and a little bit scary to find a line across, and quite strong at one point. But you cross rivers and you see yaks, and you just have all these like experiences that sort of start accumulating. And you also have some kind of bad ones, where this was on a washboard road where my butt hurt so bad. So I don't normally wear a chamois, but I carried a spare one with my extra clothes, and I literally like dived off the side of the road in like complete agony and pain. I was like, "Look at my chamois on!" Just like stripped all my clothes off, put my chamois on, got back on the bike, and I was like, "Oh, this feels so nice. Like, maybe I should have done this sooner." But yeah, you have this like horrible hot washboard, and then a few minutes later you're drinking a cold Coke with friends, and then you're camping up high in the mountains, and then you're going over ridiculous things that look like this and that never end. and then you think you've got a great descent, but you're actually just pushing your bike down an insanely steep scree slope that's super slippery, and you feel like you're going to slide down the whole thing and die. And then if you didn't think that was good enough, then you can just like try to carry your bike across these, really rushing knee-deep river crossings, and then you get to the bonus climbs, which are this kind of famous part of the race that is really not a bonus at all. They're quite shit, and you're like, I'm almost at the end, and I've got to push my bike up over stupid hills that have no point to them, and why am I here again? But, like, whatever. Then you get to some good food, and then a bridge that makes you, like, quake in your boots, where you think all the kind of boards are going to fall off, and you're going to die falling through it and break your ankle right almost at the end of the race. And then this was the last valley, and this was kind of the defining experience of the race for me. The really like just, oh my gosh, everything has come together in this crazy way. And they were about 90 kilometers down this valley, and yeah, I know, it's a beautiful valley, isn't it? And I had heard that 2 other people had gone over in the night, so 2 other women had kind of crossed. There's a huge pass at the end of the valley that you have to hike over. And my friend, I'd seen on social media that my friend Jade had gone over it the night before in like a crazy snowstorm and -4. And I knew that Hannah, who won the race, had gone over it the night before she won. And I got into my head, like, this is the last thing that I'm really afraid of. I'm really afraid of being wet and cold in the dark. This is like Scotland. This is Scotland. This is like, my life in Scotland is like wet and cold in the dark. Like, it's just my kind of paranoia terror that has become embedded in my head since living here. And I was like, okay, Kat, like, you really want to go over this pass. If you really want to do it, what do you have to do? Okay, first you have to eat, because once it gets dark and cold, you're not going to stop to eat. So I ate this horrible pulverized, mashed thing of tin fish that have been in my bag for forever. And then I was like, okay, now you have to have a strategy. So I was like, okay, if it rains, then I don't have to go over. I'll camp in the valley and it will be fine. If it doesn't rain, then I'll go over because I'll be dry and everything will be fine, and it will only be cold and dark and not wet and cold and dark. So I had my little strategy in mind, and then as I just made my strategy and I came up to the media car, and there was Alan who did the podcast, and I kind of had some pretty incredible conversations with Alan over the course of the race that had helped me kind of reconnect with what it was, why I was really there, and what my emotions were, and what had brought me there in the first place. And this is like the sequence of emotions. And it was like this, and then like this. And that was all in the course of about 5 minutes. So basically what ended up happening, it did rain, but I'd really got into my head that I wanted to get over this pass. So I made a strategy about how I would get dry, and I went, after the rain finished, I changed much of my clothes, I got a whole bunch of warm stuff on, and I just put my head down and I was like, I'm going to get up and over this pass. And this is what it would have looked like if I'd seen it in the daytime. But I was going over in the pitch dark, basically pushing along boulders, along scree slopes. It had all kinds of landslides. You just didn't really know where you were going. The GPX track was telling you to basically throw yourself off of a cliff. And you're like, well, I guess that wouldn't be a good idea, so maybe I'll try this route. And you're picking your way across and basically falling asleep, standing up. But I made it to the top. And this is sort of this iconic gate that when you get to the gate, you know that you're done. You just have to get down the hill and get to the finish line. And I got to the gate, and I thought I was going to have this like incredible, like, oh, I've done it. This is like the moment, And I just was like, oh, I'm at the gate now. I think partly because I was pretty delirious, and I did make it down the other side and to the finish line. But I think it was not the gate that was the defining moment. It was before, when I was in the valley, and I had just, in that valley, I just wanted to pause everything and stay. I was like, I don't want this race to end. And it was because it had been such a transformative experience for me to go from that like fear and anxiety and stuff that had been in my life, not just in the few months before the race, but for years. And I just had shed it all. And I didn't know, I wasn't sitting there being like, now my life is now transformed, but I felt so different. And I was like, I just don't want this to stop. I don't want to go back to that thing. I want to just pause and stay here. And obviously I couldn't do that, but I think that that was just like the defining moment of the race for me, was that it was just reconnecting with like why I really, really love to do these things and what they mean to me. And also, yeah, you can go back to the narrative. Okay, if you put yourself through really hard stuff, it does change you, and it helps you to learn and deal with things and blah blah blah. And maybe it did, but I think just what I had to learn was not to be so afraid. And the last kind of interview that I had with Alan, I had a chance to kind of to reflect on it, and I wasn't really quite sure where I'd gotten to with the race. I was like, I don't know what I have to say at the end. I'm also sleep deprived and don't really know what's going on. But it was the kind of thing that I took away from it was just that I needed to not be so afraid of things and to sort of just be comfortable to step into that space of being like, well, yes, I am afraid, but I don't have to be controlled by this fear. And I also can create my own narratives about what I enjoy, and I don't have to race at a certain pace or achieve a certain thing or look a certain way or have my bike be so light or whatever. I finished the race in good time, and most importantly, I loved, like, after the first couple of days, and apart from the few low points that you do have, naturally, of course, I loved every minute of it. No, that would be a total lie. But I had like this kind of amazing feeling through the whole thing. And I'm just really grateful to Kyrgyzstan for its absolutely beautiful landscapes, which really brought me so much joy. And to the people who encouraged me and supported me along the way, many of whom are in this room and elsewhere, to help me get there, because it was just a fantastic and amazing and really special experience. And when I got home, one of my friends sent me a message, and he said, "Kat, was it transcendent?" And I was like, yes, it was transcendent.
Right, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions first, and then we'll have the audience questions. So, do you think you get any advantages or disadvantages by training in Scotland?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned a few about the bogs and the cold and the wet. I think that well, if you embrace the weather in Scotland, then you become really resilient in a lot of circumstances. You are not resilient in the heat, which is a disadvantage for sure. And if you struggle with these feelings of being cold and wet all the time, and you don't like them, then you build up kind of narratives in your head of anxiety about being cold and wet, which is what's happened to me. So I think that's like learning to cope with it is an advantage, but having perpetual anxiety about it is a disadvantage.
So you said you went there to tour first for a month?
We rode bikes for 2 weeks before. Yeah.
How do you get the annual leave and money to do all of it?
Yeah. So in this case, I have my own company, and I kindly asked my colleagues, one of whom had been to Kyrgyzstan before and really loved it, if they would possibly let me take some extra time off. So I just took unpaid leave, which they allowed. But I think with all the touring that I did previous to that, that was when I was quite young, and a lot of people would be like, "Oh, I wish I could live your life, but I don't have any money. Like, how do you do that?" And basically, I was very motivated to travel and adventure, and I just found jobs where I could work for a year and then travel afterwards, and I just saved and saved and saved and saved and saved, and like didn't spend a lot of money, and I managed to kind of work and save through what I was doing. I did have a privilege in that I didn't have to pay for my university education. In the States, a lot of people walk away from university with huge loans, so I didn't have that, but and obviously I also have a very supportive family, so I did go live at home for periods of time between big adventures, and those things are super important, but I was able to fund them just from working. This you have to have a really good job to ride Silk Road. It's quite a bit harder to fund than just a tour. And I guess I would add that I think that's a big consideration, and it was for me when I was saying I don't want to do more ultras, is they are really expensive, the combination of the travel, and they're a big environmental impact, and that's also, the travel and everything, and that's huge. They're not as big environmental impact as going on a cruise holiday, so it's all relative. But if you're considering, the choices that you make, like they're, I think, preparing the kit and paying the fees and flying with your bike, it was not expensive at all to be in Kyrgyzstan, but I spent far too much money trying to get there, and yeah.
Right. Any questions from the audience now?
how does it feel to have come full circle and be one of those people on Instagram that other people see and inspire them to do these things?
I don't know. I'm trying not to be. I don't know. I think I've been having some chats with people in my coaching circle about this, and how you process the information that comes at you through social media depends a lot on the state that you're in personally. And if you're resilient and if you're in a good place, you can see it as inspiring and really helpful. And it's amazing. There's so many other stories out there and YouTube videos and all these kinds of things. But I think taking a break from it from time to time, or also just getting away from it, or if you realize that it's becoming unhealthy, to step away from it is really important. But it's so hard because all your friends are on Instagram. What are you supposed to do?
Any other questions?
I'll just shout it. I'm just wondering how you dealt with the altitude. Was it just your 2 weeks touring before the trip, or did you do anything else to deal with that?
Yeah, I'm very lucky. I've not had much issues with altitude. So Jade and I went up to 3,800 meters on our second day in Kyrgyzstan, and I didn't have any problems. Jade really, really, really struggled. She had a lot of breathing issues that day. So what we did for the rest of the tour was spend as many nights as we could over 3,000 meters to get used to it. But I think I've had altitude issues like over 4.5 or 5,000, but not over like 3 or around 3 or 4. So it just depends. But you can take altitude medication; it helps sometimes. But the acclimatization was really helpful with the tour for sure.
Anyone else?
Did you have any issues with reliability of the bike or any kits you had with you?
I got a puncture about an hour from the finish, and I was pretty delirious. And basically, I needed to put extra sealant in my tires before I started, and I was too lazy, and I got sick before the race, and I didn't do it. And I think that I wouldn't have had the puncture if I'd put the sealant in. And I just couldn't fix it. Like, I tried plugging it, but the tire had come unsealed from the rim, and I couldn't get it to seal, so I stuck a tube in. But I lost like an hour doing that. So not that it really matters, but if you finish in under X number of days, like if you finish in 12 days and 59 minutes, that's like a 12 days finish. And I finished in 13 days and 47 minutes, which was really annoying.
So are you definitely not doing any ultras at all in 2025, or will it just be the Highland Trail 550 every single time until you get over your perishing fear of the Highlands?
That's never going to happen. I have made no promise not to race in 2025. I think I have a better relationship with racing now, but if I feel that it's getting unhealthy again, then I will not. So I'm still on the fence about it. If anybody would like to go on an enormous tour of South America next summer so that I wouldn't have to race, just let me know. That's what I'd really like to do.
There's another one back here.
Do you feel like you have unfinished business with the Atlas Mountain Race?
No. I had my little FOMO, and I was like, no, I don't want to do it. I do these things, kind of why I gave these in my introduction about loving the outdoors, is because there's very specific kind of landscapes that I love, and I think that if I'm going to take time off work and put all the effort in to prepare for something and spend a bunch of money, I want to go to the kind of landscapes that I really, really love, and that's mountains and rivers and like kind of really, I don't know, Atlas is just dry and hot, and it's both Atlas and Silk Road, you have basically a really high risk of getting ill. So a lot of people scratch from these races because they get ill. And you spend so much money preparing and so much money getting there and everything, and you only really have one chance. And I think it's just a really big risk. And I've traveled tons and I never got ill, and I didn't really expect to get ill in either place, and I got ill in both places. And I think that I'll also consider carefully like just the risk involved compared to the money spent. But I just don't really like hot and dry, like super dry brown places, and that was my experience of Morocco. So I might go back riding there sometime, but I'm not going to bother paying them a bunch of money to race there.
Is that it? Right. Are the entries still open for the Silk Mountain race?
They're not open yet.
Not
So
open yet.
if anybody wants to ride next year, I'm still thinking about doing it again because it was really special. And if you do a race twice, I think the first time you go to a race, you tend to have a lot of anxiety. And once you know it, even though the Silk Road, the route changes every year, but once you know a certain kind of element of stuff, it makes the next time you do it potentially a lot more fun. So, yeah, we'll see what happens.
Well, thanks very much, Kat.
Yeah.
That was really good. I don't think I'm going to sign up for it this year, but you never know. So yes, thanks everyone for coming. And could you click through the next slide, please? Right, so our next talk in December, we'll have Mike Elm talking about his adventures cycling across Europe and North Africa, and Kevin Woods talking about his Scottish mountaineering, his winter round of Munros. So it'll be on the 13th of December, so it's Friday, the same time, and we hope to see you here. And meanwhile, we're off to the Cameo Bar, so please feel free and join us. And so let's have another round of applause for our speakers, Chris and Kat. And many thanks to Mackenzie, Kirsten, George, Luke, and Tom here at Bike Trucks and Toll Hub. And thanks everyone for coming again.